We will kick it off to Corin, who's going to begin our presentation today. Thank you, Corin.
Thank you so much, Mikkel, for the introduction. We can go ahead and hop forward a couple of slides, I think. Again, my name is Corin Backegard, Associate Vice President for Campus Life and Dean of Students, and I'm really, really happy to have this opportunity to talk with all of you about our housing selection processes. If we could go back just a moment to there we are, great. I wanted to give a little bit of an overview of what it is that we'll be covering here today in our webinar, because we do want to be sure that there's a really good understanding about what the undergraduate housing context is like, share some terminology so that as we walk through the rest of these processes, we're making sure that that's well understood. We're going to talk about two of our main processes in a little bit more detail, which are the fall senior selection and spring general selection process. We will, embedded in that, talk about our specialized housing options. We want to be sure that you have a good understanding of what resources are available for your student throughout this process, and wrap up with some key takeaways and questions. I just want to note before we go on a little bit about the fact that it is November 20th, beautiful day here in Providence, Rhode Island. And most of your students, unless your student is a rising senior, if you have a junior, they are currently involved in the senior selection process. But if you have a student who is a first year or who is a sophomore, they really won't be engaging with these processes until the spring. So it may feel a little early for us to be sharing information in November that may not affect your student until January and February. But we think it's really helpful for us to be able to communicate information to students, to parents and families and campus partners as early as possible, so that everyone has a good understanding of what's ahead, what those timelines are, and as we mentioned, all of those resources that are available to help students through the process. Next slide, please. So a quick moment on our undergraduate housing context. As you may be familiar, Brown has a requirement that our undergraduates live on campus through their semester level 6. So for their first, second, and third year, they live on campus with us. And then many of our seniors choose to remain on campus even though they are no longer required to do so. We'll talk a little bit more in a moment about that senior process, because we want to have the opportunity to prioritize for those students who are choosing to stay with us for that final fourth year. The Office of Residential Life is really managing multiple processes throughout the year. There is almost not a month in the calendar year that Res Life is not doing something related to housing assignments and placements. So we just wanted to briefly distinguish between those two, that a placement is a circumstance in which Residential Life is making the room assignment for the student based on certain criteria. This is one of the versions your students experienced as a first year student. All of the new undergraduate, the first years and the transfer students, they are placed in their housing assignment. After that first year assignment, students have the option now to select their own room through the process, but there are still some processes that have placement as their component. So you'll hear us use those two words, and they do have a slightly different meaning. As you'll see as we walk through the rest of the presentation, upper class students have a lot of options to choose among, and that's why that education, awareness building, and student support is so important for us, so that students understand what those options are so that they can make really well-informed decisions about those choices. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit more on terminology. In just a moment, we're going to go and have some more focused attention on what we refer to as the fall senior selection. So this is the process that's open right now for priority access for rising seniors. So if you have a student who is a current junior, they have the opportunity now in the fall to choose what their housing will be next year. Brenda's going to talk about that in more detail in just a moment. We also have what we refer to as specialized housing, and there are several subcategories under specialized housing. One of those that we'll talk more about is special interest housing. So for single sex, single gender, substance-free or quiet housing. Students also, if they are a member of a residential Greek letter organization, they have a separate housing process, as do our program and theme houses. So again, we'll talk more about our specialized housing, but when we use that as an umbrella term, those are the four processes, or four of the processes that are under specialized housing. We also have spring general selection. This is where the majority of students are selecting their housing for next year, and that does happen in the spring. Most of our rising sophomores and our rising juniors are really going to be selecting housing through that process. That is also the option where some juniors, current sophomores will be juniors, may have an opportunity if they're interested in requesting or expressing interest in off-campus permission, since we do have some of our juniors receive permission to live off campus in their junior year. All right, I think the next slide, I hand things over to Brenda.
Yes, this would be the part where you hear from me. Hello, everyone. Again, Brenda Ice. I serve as the Assistant Vice President of Residential and Community Living. For those that have been familiar with me over the year with the webinar, I love being able to share in advance, particularly with parents and families, the experience that their students are going to have. With a little nuances, you're not going to get all the details our students get, but you have a broader overview of what your student is experiencing when they think about their decisions for housing for the upcoming year. So as Corin alluded to, we are in the fall semester and we're actually actively engaged in our current fall general selection process. And this is primarily focused on those rising seniors. And so we actually create a moment where we want to identify how many seniors actually want to live on campus with us, since they are not bound by our residency requirement. That then allows us to know how many spaces would in fact be available for the remainder of our students, and then create that window or threshold that if we need to release those rising juniors off campus, we know exactly how many based off the number of students that will need to be guaranteed housing for the upcoming academic year. So that application for the fall was already released and opened up on the 15th and will actually close on November 30th. Students have received initial communication and reminder communications and will continue to get that right up until the day before the application closes. What we do is our system is automated that you're not going to get the same reminder and over again. So if you were one of the early applicants who submitted, you get a confirmation that says you're complete, but then we send a reminder, not that you haven't completed it, but to remind you that this was your choice in when you submit it. And if there's still decisions that you want to go back and revisit, you have the ability to do so. We also then send reminders to those who might have started and not completed. And so this is our way of saying, it will feel like a lot of communication is coming from us, but we want to make sure the students are most informed about these decision points, particularly with seniors, because there could be some financial penalties that you'll see here in our schedule later on. The closure happens over our Thanksgiving break, and so that is why we're taking additional steps to provide as many reminders and reminding you in today's conversation to ping your students to say, do the thing by the deadline to ensure you have the housing you need for the upcoming year. As always in our practice, we do collaborate and work very closely with our Student Accessibility Services, or SAS, to support students who have identified housing accommodation needs that their office reviews, approves, and then notifies us of those so that we can do that level of placement for those students in advance of selection of others. And that deadline is today. Students were made aware early on that they should be going through this process, but they would want to make sure that they have submitted their documentation as a priority deadline by this date to ensure we can pre-place them before others make their selection. And then if they're going through general selection, that deadline, or excuse me, that selection day is going to be on December 11th, the last day of our reading period before they move into finals. When we think about the fall selection process, our seniors or rising seniors have three options to choose from. They have the ability to there's actually four, but three with the application. The first is to say that they're just going to live off campus. And by not completing the form is the indication that they have no interest in living on campus with us. At the conclusion of this, we'll reach out to anyone who didn't submit and confirm that that in fact will be their status for the upcoming year. If, however, an application is completed and a student wishes to live on campus in some form, there are three options available to them. The first is to indicate that they want to go through selection on December 11th and either select a single that's available in the inventory or live amongst other rising seniors in their selection process. And that's a series of pages that they review and make that selection. And then their application is complete. There are two other options where a student could, I'm going to use the language defer or pause their selection for this fall because they have interest in participating in one of our two options that's available in the spring. The first is the specialized housing, and on a subsequent slide, I'll explain in greater detail what that would mean, but that would be a student that wants to participate in either special interest, Greek program, theme housing, or to express a religious request that they told us they want to live off campus but want to participate later on, and we hold those and revisit those when they resume studies in the spring. And then the other part is that they want to live on campus, but they're choosing to live with other mixed class students. And so when we, since a rising sophomore, or excuse me, a rising junior wouldn't have access to our fall process, rather than move them in and let them select early, we ask the seniors to pause their decision-making and participate in the spring such that they can then form that group and live with the mixed class year. And so those are the options available to rising seniors as they go through that process. I alluded to earlier is that seniors aren't bound by a residency requirement, but we do want to have the ability to know that this is a space we need to hold for them. And so we have created a cancellation structure in place for seniors to know that decisions need to be made and committed to no later than January 31st. And as long as they indicate, even if they apply and pick a room during fall selection on December 11th, and then over the winter break period, determine or discover that there is opportunity to live off campus or do something different and not hold on-campus housing, as long as they notify us by the 31st of January, there is no penalty or fee applied to remove them from our inventory. And then you can see here on the structure, there are going to be financial penalties potentially that could be applied to a student if they make notification on or after these particular time periods. One note is that in our specialized communities, if they find that they are not placed or approved to be in those communities, we do create a moment where they could be released to live off campus, and that cancellation fee structure that I just provided to you is not applicable because they didn't necessarily get into the place that they had desired during the spring selection process. Next slide. All right, and then we move into spring. No sooner do our students return, classes begin on the 21st of January, the following week, we open up the process to begin our spring general selection process. And this is where the bulk of housing decisions are made by all other students bound by our residency requirement, or in some instances who are interested in living on campus participate. The application will open on January 26th and close on February 24th. So we give students about a month to figure out what they would like to do for the upcoming academic year. It's also important to say this is why we tell you now when these application processes are going to be in place so that you can actually be more thoughtful and intentional over winter break periods and Thanksgiving break periods to consider all of the options available to you so you're that much more informed when the application goes live. As we did in the fall, there are priority deadlines established with SAS, our Student Accessibility Service. And so that deadline in the spring aligns with the closure of the spring application. I do want to make note that these are priority deadlines for consideration of pre-placement while we still have greater availability of our housing stock. It doesn't mean that a student can't still submit a request for an accommodation review, whether that be for housing or even more broadly outside of the scope of housing. SAS is always going to entertain and do an intake process with every student, but we do ask for this priority so that we have a greater availability of inventory to place the student that best meets the approved accommodation that's listed and shared with us. We go through a series of our processes review, you'll see a bit of a gap between when the application closes and when students can then start making decisions around their group formation. And that is for us to then do a bit of the housekeeping, if you will, and sorting for our specialized communities. And so during that period between February 24th and March 24th is where we are focusing on that specialized housing option, the pre-placement of any housing accommodations, and any other placements or special placements that we need to consider. So the group formation, for folks to be aware, is a student's ability to then identify 1, 2, 3, however many students they would like to live with, to be able to start setting plans of who they would want to live with. And then they start to receive an inventory of the available spaces that match their group size. And then their selection actually takes place after their spring break, but certainly before finals on April 6th, 7th, and 8th. And we do that over a period of 3 days in order of seniority. And so those who are rising seniors receive a time slot and go through a selection period, then rising juniors, and then the sophomores. The other options available throughout this general selection. So if I, as a student, just know I want to live with this person and I don't necessarily have an accommodation to be considered or don't want any specialized housing, their process is done in that first few bullets that I provided. However, because we want to create as much choice and opportunity for students to live where they would like to, we do create these specialized options. And on the next page, I'll explain in greater detail what those are. Those options then allow students to make a singular choice about where they might want to spend their next academic year living with us on campus. And the options then available to them, depending on the location that they choose, is either individually based, or in some, it is group selection based off the cohort of where that particular specialized community might live. A new feature added on this year is that ultimately we get students who wish to change their room assignment. And what we have tended to do is to wait until the start of the academic year before we would entertain those types of room changes. What we continue to receive feedback from our students is that it's not that there's a conflict with the person they're living with. There's just a desire to perhaps be in a different room, and they know someone who would like to make the swap with them. So we have created a new module that will allow for room swap to take place during the active spring term for students in those particular communities. And so if they already know that there's a space in, let's say, in general selection, that they would just like to swap with another student, they have the ability to do that on their own without there being communications or this process of engaging our residential life team to do that. We will create the platform in the spring. We'll provide greater detail of how that works, but we want to give a level of agency to students to make those types of changes while still honoring what we would do in the start of each semester if there truly are room changes that need to happen that aren't necessarily considered a swap. Next slide. Now, here's where we will talk about all of those wonderful options available to our students. Again, the idea is about choice. And I want to make sure that we emphasize that these are options. No one is required to go through these or pick one of these, but we want to make sure that if it is a desire for a student to, particularly on this slide, talk about our special interest housing, that we make it available to them so they understand this could be a choice that is different from just general selection. And so we have, over the years, provided 3 special interest opportunities for our students. And in this new academic year, we're introducing a 4th. We will offer what is considered single-sex housing, and those would be designated floors that are either female only or male only based on the student's sex assigned at birth, which is identified and provided through our system of record that's captured through our registrar's office. And so a student can indicate that is where I would want to go. The other option available to them is single gender housing as an option. And the distinction here is that it's not floors, but units. And that could be inclusive of standalone rooms, suites, apartments, or perhaps floors. where students are assigned and share the same gender identity as indicated on their housing application. And the distinction I want to draw here is that the system of record is preset and not to be modified on the application, but in the single gender, the student has agency to indicate their gender identity if this is the option that they choose. Additionally, they can select quiet housing, and these are residential environments that allow for students to sleep and study 24/7 in a relatively quiet environment. Quiet is always relative, but at least those students going in all agree that they would work to create a level of quiet that is conducive for everyone to feel comfortable in the space. And then we also provide substance-free housing, which again is another residential environment where students commit to neither either them or their guests who come to visit to consume alcohol or other substances that might otherwise impair their cognitive functions. Again, optional opportunities. The thing I want to leave you with before we move to the rest of our specialized housing options is that if a student indicates that they have interest in one of these, it is guaranteed placement. And so what we will say is that if this is important enough to you that this is where you would like to live, we're going to guarantee that you will be placed in that particular community. Because we want to ensure that we meet all needs, students will not know in advance where the location of these particular communities will take place, because it is going to be driven by the number of applicants who express interest in that. And as soon as we know the total number, then we will begin to make the placement based off of the available inventory that we have, and then notify the students that this is their guaranteed placement for the upcoming year. Next slide. Continued, we still provide more choice. And so here we talk about our program and theme communities. Nationally speaking, these would be living learning communities or opportunities where students come together with a shared interest in or affinity based housing opportunity for our students. We on our campus have 8 student-led program communities and 5 university-led theme communities. And the distinction there is that our university-led theme communities are in partnership with other departments around campus. And so on our website and other resources that we'll provide you as part of this webinar, you can actually visit our links and see a full description of each of those communities. Your students already know what they are and have access to them, but if you have interest in knowing what those 5 and 8 and even so much as our 10 Greek letter organizations, you can go through and learn more about those programs. In our program and theme communities, we'll create a lottery system where students will in fact select or express interest in those communities. In that instance, they are not necessarily guaranteed placement in the community, but guaranteed to be considered in the lottery based off the allotment that these communities exist. In the previous slide, we said we wouldn't know where those communities were because it's driven by the number of applicants. In our program, Greek and theme communities, we know where those places are, and we would have already set a preset or an allotment number for each of those communities, and then based off of that interest, be able to determine whether a lottery is needed. If there are greater applicants than the bed space, we would do that and then make sure that those students who participate in the lottery and then are selected are then guaranteed and placed in that particular community. If the number of applicants is greater than the number of bed space allocated, those students who aren't selected as part of that community will then still have an opportunity to participate in general selection. The same is true for that of Greek letter organization, except that there's a slight nuance there where we will ask those memberships to provide verification that those students are actually eligible to participate in their Greek letter organization. And then much of what I described in the program and theme would still be applicable in terms of placement in those particular communities. If there was a number of greater than the students who expressed interest in the house and allotment, then those students would understand they would be placed, and anyone left over would still have access to participate in general lottery. Religious request is another option that we provide to our students, and they can submit an application and provide information to our office specifically so that we can consider specialized placement that supports their religious observances or practices. And then we've expressed this time and time again throughout our conversation. We create these options for students. They are not required to do so, but in the moment that they have indicated and expressed enough interest in this, it is a guaranteed placement. And the other important factor is that they're only selecting one. And so while we're creating a great deal of choice and options to them, we want them to make the decision about which one community is of greater importance for them as they think about all of the options, and to select that one with the understanding that if they are in fact placed or selected to be in that will be their commitment for the year. Next slide. I believe this is you, Corin.
Thank you. Yes, it is. So we know that when we shared the email to all of our residential students, all of our undergraduate students last week, outlining what the processes were going to be for this year, we know there were a lot of questions particular to the implications for the program community. So that's why we wanted to spend just a little bit of time making some clarifications, because I think there are some pieces of information that are not entirely accurate that I think are part of those concerns. So we want to be sure that we have an opportunity to underscore that Brown remains committed to our program communities. We are not altering the number. We're not altering the number of students available to these students. So the program communities remain an important part of our residential offerings and residential experience. The program communities are also going to remain student-led communities where students are coming together around shared interests and values, and where the student leadership are really shaping the culture, the traditions, the mission, the activities. That is all going to remain student-led, student-focused, and student-centered. We are going to, and we're in conversations right now with the student leaders of those program houses to talk about what the process is going to be for them, so that the leadership for the student program houses will be pre-assigned to the houses in advance, and to provide a pathway for some of the current residents of the houses to join the community through pre-assignment outside of that lottery that we described for the spring. So these are part of ongoing conversations that we're having with the student leaders of those program houses. But an overarching goal here for us in making the changes that we have of introducing that lottery is to say that this is to make sure we're standardizing these housing processes to make them more equitable and transparent for all of our students. This way, students who want the opportunity to join those communities and have that experience have equal access to join that through the lottery. And that's something that, we're talking about here specific in the context of the program communities, but is also true for those theme houses as well. And one of the things that is so important to us, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide too, is related to education. We want to be sure that on our side, we are doing a very good job explaining to students what their options are, when they can make multiple choices and when they can make only one choice, and to make it really clear, because we want all of our students to be able to make very informed choices. And to understand, as Brenda was explaining, if students apply to one of the special interest housing, so that's the single sex, single gender, sub-free, and quiet, those are a guaranteed placement for the students who say interest. If they indicate that in their application, they can have confidence that they will receive that housing type. That is a guarantee. But we also need our other students to understand that if they select one of the other housing types, that they may or may not receive that, but if they do, that is a commitment to that community. And again, this is information we're going to make really clear through our information that we're sharing with students. And again, we're very early in the process, but that's something we want to make sure that is very, very well understood for students as they go forward. Next slide, please. So here we want to underscore some of the student resources that are available to your student. And we put this on the website, and we'll share the links probably here in the chat. But if you go to the Residential Life website, you'll be able to navigate to these at any time. When we send messages to students about the housing process, we archive that on the website so that if students need to find it later, they don't necessarily need to dig through their email, but can always go back to the website and find and refer to that information. And we think that that's helpful for you as parents and guardians and family members to also be able to see the messages that we're sending to students. So when you go to the Residential Life website, you'll see a section on the far right that says community messages, and that's where we will host and archive those emails that we're sending out to students. We also have a dedicated page on housing selection resources because we're aware that we live this every day. So this terminology comes very readily to us. We understand in our mind kind of the flow chart from one process to another. And we know that that's not necessarily intuitive to students or the others trying to navigate that process. So we've put together on this selection resource page, it has the full selection timeline. You'll see the dates when applications open and close. You'll see the priority deadlines. And we can talk a little bit more because I know we've had some other questions about what is happening between the application closing in the end of February and something else happening later in March. So we can talk a little bit about what's happening in that time frame. But we want that full selection timeline to be readily available to everyone, again, so that we can mark calendars and make sure everybody is informed and is able to meet those deadlines. We also have a visual guide, a table on that website that really shows and breaks down the different specialized housing options, what those implications are, what the placement or selection process looks like, so that that is really well understood as a quick guide for students and others seeking to understand the process. We also will be offering in the spring residence hall tours and staff informational tabling, because again, we want students to be able to get as much information as they need to understand all of these choices. And we're very early in the process here at the end of November, but we want to have a long timeline for students to have be able to get the information that they need. Residential Life also offers office hours and information sessions. So the office hour schedule is on the website. There are office hours daily through the end of this semester through December 19. We will probably take a break on the days the university is closed for Thanksgiving, but otherwise students can find us every day through December 19 for any of those questions. And then we will resume that in January when we're getting closer to the opening of the application at the end of January. So those are just some of the resources that are available. And we always want to make sure if there is something that they need that we haven't yet created, we're happy to hear that feedback of what other resources or assets would be helpful for students to navigate this process. Next slide, please.
All right. And so when I said earlier that we send numerous reminders to the students so they understand, this is our way of giving you your reminder of all the things we just talked about in this particular webinar. Again, the first is that we're currently in the process for our fall selection application, and it closes on November 30th. And then those students that are who have actively said that they want to select this fall will make those selections on December 11th. Spring general selection, again, opens on January 26th, a week after we return to start the spring term, and closes on February 24th. And then students make their selection April 6th through the 8th. I did get a sneak peek at one of the questions about why the big gap in between. What is happening in between that period is on that application, students are indicating they either want to participate in general or participate in specialized. If they selected the specialized at the end of the 24th up until the May 24th, when group formation takes place, is when our team is doing that back-end placement and consideration and reaching out for roster verification to ensure that all of those students are automatically pre-placed, because if in the event that a lottery needs to be used in those placements, those students still need to go through general placement, and we want to ensure that they're included in general selection, given a selection time, and then have the ability to participate in group formation and participate with other students selecting April 6th through the 8th. Our SAS office has priority deadlines. Again, there's no deadline of when you need to, hard deadline of when you need to submit a need for accommodations, but priority review allows us to know the information in advance to help in that pre-placement before the rest of the housing is selected by our students. For the fall semester, the deadline to submit is the 20th, and that is specific to those seniors going through selection on December 11th. And if you find yourself in and you're not a rising senior, you can submit now. But the deadline for consideration or priority deadline for consideration for spring placement is February 24th. And then again, to reinforce our specialized housing options, which is inclusive of our special interest, Greek program, theme, or religious requests, is that students will need to make one selection of the community type that they wish to participate in. And by doing so, if placed, then they are committing to be in that placement. And then there is not an option to decline and participate in general selection unless they're in their lottery selection, they aren't selected as part of that particular placement, and they will then have the ability to move through general selection. I know you can move to the next slide. We recognize that this is a lot of information, but we thought we wanted to be able to provide just an overview for you to have a greater awareness of what your students are hearing from us. By all means, as much as we tell them to reach out if they have questions, we encourage you to do the same. At this point, I'll turn it over to Mikkel, and I guess we'll answer a few questions.
All right, thank you both. This is a lot of information and we have lots of questions. We're going to try and get through these as quickly as we can. However, per usual, if you have questions that have not been answered during this session, you can send them to me at family@brown.edu, and I will respond to those and get them where they need to go. Or there's also res_life@brown.edu, and Brenda's team is there, and they are the experts in this area. I'm going to give Brenda just a quick break to catch her breath. Corin, can you talk about why we're making this change right now?
The change specifically for the
To the process.
Right. So some of the
Yeah.
changes that what we've made is we've been really working to simplify as you've seen and heard, this is a pretty complicated process for students with a lot of choices that are available to them. So some of the changes that we've made related to the specialized housing are to say any application, any expression of interest for the special interest housing, that those are guaranteed. That was something for us to really make sure that it was understood that students knew if they made that selection, that those housing types would be guaranteed. And so that really necessitated for us also making sure that part of this was to say, we want students to go through the processes of identifying what is most important to them and making one selection overall. So that intersects, of course, with the program, the theme, and the Greek housing as well. We really want to be sure on this point of equitable access because Brown has been invested for well over a year now in making sure that it is clear in our community and we understand that we're complying with our own policies and expectations under the law that there's equitable access for all programs and activities on campus, and that there are not exclusions or restrictions based on any identities or protected classes. And so this is an important aspect for us for making sure that there is true and equitable access for students to all of the program and the theme houses. Again, we want to make sure that we're really helping to communicate this well to students, what the changes are, what the implications are for them, so that they can make really well-informed choices about what part of their residential experience next year is most important to them, and to provide a lot of support to the student leaders of the program houses so that they can help share information about what the special focus and emphasis and traditions of their communities are so that we can get a really good match with the students who are expressing interest.
Great. Thank you so much, Corin. Brenda, we had a question that came in through the registration process saying, in this person's specific situation, their student, if they both want both a female roommate and someone who doesn't drink or smoke, how do they navigate that, that preference?
Yes. So in there are a couple of options to the student. And so the first is for them to make a decision on their own and choose to go through general selection. And at that point, they may have already identified an individual, someone on the hall or their current roommate that aligns with the way in which they would like to live. In that instance, they've already preset who they know they want to live with. They can simply move through the general selection process. And when their time slot becomes available, the two of them select a room that matches and supports their need. If they find themselves needing or desiring, because I want to parse this out, a need to be in what is considered substance free, then that would be one of those special interest community opportunities where they would make that singular choice and make that particular decision there. And then if they're looking to be in female only identified space, then that would be the single sex option that they would choose. If this particular caller or registrant is on the call and has further clarification, either redirect their student to come see us directly or send an email if that wasn't fully clear and made transparent to you. We're happy to continue through those conversations with you.
Great. Thank you, Brenda. Next question for you, Corin. Can you talk about how students were involved with some of the process, the discussions about process changes?
For the process writ large or specific
Sorry, the
to
program,
house?
let me narrow this down. How specifically were program house leaders involved in this change decision making?
Oh, sure. Thank you. So the decision really to standardize what we need to do in relation to our placement and selection processes really was part of this broader university effort to make sure that we're ensuring equitable access. So we had an opportunity to share the information to the student leaders of the program houses before the housing changes and the process was launched to all of our undergraduate students. And then what we've been engaged in follow-up afterwards is conversations about what that implementation will look like. Because we're really hearing and responding to that feedback from the student leaders of these groups of how we make sure that we maintain commitment to these really special communities, how we maintain program continuity through student leadership and returning residents. And that's an important part of making sure that we preserve the student-centeredness of the focus in these communities. So that work is ongoing and part of conversations that are happening between residential life and the program house leadership this week, and I think going into the beginning of next week.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Brenda, I'm going to combine two questions. Ready? One is, why are we talking about this now? And the second one is, in the spring, after kids have had a break, will they have opportunities to ask questions again and get more information once they're back on campus?
Sure. We talk about it now because we talk about it now. And we recognize that the more we can share in advance of the processes actually happen, the greater opportunity for us to maybe minimize or reduce the level of concern or anxiety around housing selection for the upcoming year. We recognize as a industry that this is a decision point that can create angst for many students who are living residentially with us. And so rather than wait until a week before selection and tell them all the things they need to do, we are kind of doing this slow burn, if you will. Here are all the considerations that are going to be available to you. Review them at your pace. If you know that you're just going to go through general selection, you quite honestly can ignore every communication we have until it's time to complete the application. However, if you are interested in one of these specialized communities, we want to give you opportunity now while you're still actively on campus to engage with those students who currently live in that community, or to show up at an open house or a mixer or meet with us to learn more about what it would mean for them to make that decision. And so that is the why now. And then what we hope that will happen is that maybe you aren't thinking about it now because the focus is on academics, and yay, good, that's what you should be doing. During break period is now where you have the ability to really think thoughtfully around that. And so when you return in the spring, we will continue to offer office hours and information sessions. Our tabling actually is in the residence halls as well as our dining facilities. And so we will put ourselves in spaces where it is more convenient for the student to walk up to us and ask a question than to adjust their pattern or traffic and come over to one of our office hours. We will create as many opportunities as we can so that the students are most informed about the decision they need to make, particularly in this new model where it is one singular choice if they're going to go through that optional, one of those specialized community options, that we want to make sure that they know all the things they need to know.
So it's like all our summer webinars where we're telling parents your student has this in their inbox, right? There's a
Yes.
lot of communication. I want to get to a couple of questions that have come through, specifically one from a few folks whose students are juniors, and they're asking about how their junior student gets permission to live off campus. Brown has a 6-semester requirement. I don't know, Brenda, do you want to speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. And so what happens, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is that we start by asking the seniors who aren't bound by a residence required to give us indication that they intend to live on campus. Knowing how many of that population are going to hold space for the upcoming year allows us to then take true stock of our inventory to see what availability we have more broadly to then meet the need of all students who are required to live on campus. There's a small valve we will need to release if the number of beds doesn't necessarily match our residency requirement. And that is when we would create this off-campus permission for our juniors to live off campus. None of them are guaranteed. And again, it is an option to choose. And so while the application is going to be open for our students to submit the application to live on campus, there will be a parallel application open for rising juniors to indicate interest in potentially being considered part of this off-campus lottery process. If we determine that there is a number that we will need to release a certain number of juniors, if that student has expressed interest in that particular process, then we go through and through a rolling basis start to notify them that they have permission. And it is only with us notifying them that they know they have permission. Submitting interest is not the guarantee, and you should not be looking for apartments or signing leases in advance of receiving the confirmation from our office.
Yeah, that's a very important note. And similarly, so right now, there's nothing juniors need to do, right?
No.
Okay, all right, so that comes after the senior process.
Yes.
Excellent. We had, this is not a study abroad webinar, we do that in January, but we had a couple of people who asked about how this works with study abroad when there's just a request to just live on campus for one semester. Can you quickly touch on that?
Sure. We are in direct communication and partnership with the college and the colleagues that support the study abroad and study away programs. We provide enough information in advance for our students so that they can make informed decisions about when and what semester they would wish to study abroad. If they intend to be on campus in the fall semester, they go through our general selection process and pick a room. If they are going to be abroad or away in the fall, we know that we get an indication of that commitment. They're removed from our housing selection process. And then at some point during their fall term, we open up what we call a mid-year process. And then we re-engage those students who are abroad in the fall and any other student who might be on a leave or otherwise not on campus to say, give us your intent for next spring. And that's when those study abroad students, particularly who are away in the fall, express interest in coming back to campus.
Great, thank you. Corin, can you talk a little bit about what happens between the selection, when the application process ends and the selection process begins?
Yes, and I may turn to Brenda for some of the details on that, because I think it's a really good question about why is there this what looks like a pretty significant gap in time between when the students submit their spring application when that closes at the end of February and when they're actually making their selections in April. So this can feel like a really long timeline for our students between that completion of the application and when the information comes out. or when they're making the selection. There's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes in residential life because we are looking at all of those responses for the specialized housing types. We're making sure that we're understanding how those pieces can come together. Students then will need to, there's a timeline and a process for them to be able to form groups so that they know who the other students are that they would like to select with. First, we need to know who wants housing and what housing type, and then which students are eligible to be in those group selection processes with one another. So that's an important time where we're also, again, providing a lot of support for students to identify who might be the roommate you would be interested in. Do you have one other person who you really, really want to room with, or do you have a larger group that you would like to form as part of your selection process? A lot of that education around the housing, the residence hall tours, of understanding what the rooms are that are going to be available when the selection day's opening is happening. And then I think we've also seen some questions about, and understandably, a lot of curiosity about who is that roommate. So within the specialized housing types, the students will get to choose their roommate among the other people who are selecting to live in that community. So there will be in this timeline another sub process for students who have been identified for that specialized housing type to choose rooms and roommates from within that community. I should also note, because I think sometimes this is a question, and I've seen this in some of the questions submitted about how can I be sure if my student is interested in one of the specialized housing types that they also have a roommate, for example, who is the same sex that they are. And I'll just note that is our default assignment either rule or the configuration. The default is going to be that students are that roommate pairs that would happen would be based on that sex assigned at birth in the application, although students can make those other choices. So students have a lot of choice over who their roommates are, whether that's within a specialized community or whether they're going through the group selection process. And Brenda, you can correct if there was anything
No,
there that I
everything you
misstated.
said was correct. I will add that there's two other things to consider why there is that kind of gap between selection day and end of application. The last question you just answered around study abroad and study away is that they have a timeline that is slightly off from when we need to do ours. And so we need to allow for them to move through that commitment and confirmation. And so that there's another kind of gap in period that we're working with. And then there's spring break that actually is happening in that. And so we aren't going to create processes during a period where students may actually be taking a break and just stepping away from campus or academics for the year. And so that extra week built in is another eats up some of that kind of gap process that we're working through.
Well, we are very close to the end. I have one more question that came through that may sound a little basic, but I think it could be important, is students can choose communities and or request communities and roommates and preferences. Can they request a certain building, a dorm, or residence hall?
So they cannot request a particular location. They can select a particular location based off the inventory that's available. As we said before, the special interest housing, single sex, gender, sub-free, and quiet, we do not notify what location that's going to be because it's driven by the number of applicants. So in that one, they will not know the location of it, but they would need to know that this is enough of a commitment to me that I'm going to go wherever that community ends up residing. In those other specialized communities, the Greek program and theme, those locations are already preset and determined. Again, we would hope that students are making those decisions in those optional framings based off the community of which that most aligns with them, as opposed to the location of said community. We recognize that that could be a factor, but we're really hopeful in our design, and the reason why we create so many options is that we want students to truly feel like this is the place they want to live because of the community that will surround them in that.
Right, thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you, Brenda and Corin. I encourage everyone to use the resources that have been provided today. We will also have this recording posted to the parent and family webpage on the webinar section, where you'll be able to see that. If you have additional questions, you can contact me at family@brown.edu, or as we mentioned, you can go to the source at ResLife at res_life@brown.edu. And just encourage your student to be proactive in reaching out to these resources that have certainly been in communication with them. So as the bell strikes 1 here on the Brown campus, thank you, Brenda and Corin, and everyone, all the parents and families who joined us today. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.